Here is Brett Chase.
Good evening and welcome to the Environmental Exchange, Zoning and Land Use on the Southeast Side. I'm Brett Chase with the Chicago Sun-Times, and I'm joined tonight by my guests, Olga Bautista, Community Planning Manager with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, Peggy Salazar, the longtime Director of the Southeast Environmental Task Force, and Gina Ramirez, Midwest Outreach Manager for Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to thank the Chicago Community Trust for its support, and thanks to our readers and all others who support the Sun-Times' mission of accountability and transparency in government. If you read the Sun-Times and our Spanish language site, La Voz, you know that there's a big fight going on in Chicago's Southeast Side in 10th Ward, which straddles the Indiana state line. Residents have opposed the relocation of the General Iron Metal Shredder, which just closed in Lincoln Park, is being rebuilt and rebranded as Southside Recycling at East 116th Street along the Calumet River. The business needs one last permit from the city to operate, and residents, including some who went on a 30-day hunger strike, are asking Mayor Lori Lightfoot to deny the permit. Some residents complained to the federal government, and that has led to a broader investigation of the city's longtime zoning and land use practices. But tonight we focus on the broader issue. This is not a disagreement about one business. The Southeast Side is a very long and complex history. It still lives with the toxic legacy of the steel industry, which fully abandoned the area in the 1980s. The community has been looking to regain its economic footing. And my guests tonight, all lifelong residents of the Southeast Side, have been active in many controversies over government decisions that can affect residents for decades. Peggy Salazar has been actively leading community efforts on environmental issues that range from manganese and pet coke to landfills to a proposed police shooting range to a housing development that would destroy wetlands to redeveloping brownfields to the cumulative impact of air pollution, and that's just a sampling. So Peggy, start us off. Tell us a bit about the history of the area and what you see as its potential for the future. You're on mute.
Do that all the time. For those of you listening who are not familiar with the 10th Ward, first off, let me just describe it a little. So 10th Ward is the largest ward in the city of Chicago. It is approximately 12,000 acres. It's huge. We have quite a bit of vacant space, and our industrial corridor is 4,000 acres. So 4,000 of our 10th Ward, 4,000 acres of our 10th Ward is zoned for industry. And I myself, just to give you a little history, I grew up across the street from what was once U.S. Steel. And people who have never seen a steel mill, it was something to behold. I mean, the smokestacks, the smells, it would light up the sky at night once the furnaces were going. I mean, it was just something. As a kid, I remember thinking that we had these beautiful sidewalks because at night they would actually sparkle. But I didn't know that was the fallout from the steel mills. But to us, it looked pretty at night because it actually sparkled just like glitter. And here it was all the fallout that we lived with every day. It wasn't until I got older and traveled outside of my neighborhood and that I was old enough to pay attention. Because as a kid, you don't notice certain things. But once you get older, you start noticing that other neighborhoods are cleaner. The air seemed to be fresher. They just seemed to be brighter. We lived in this drab kind of sooty area, and again, not, having anything to compare to. It was our norm. It was normal for us. And so when the steel mills started to shutter, which was in the 1980s, my husband was employed there. We were devastated at first because we were like, oh my God, there goes this whole, there goes the food on our table, right? He was looking forward to, having vacation time of multiple weeks and all these things we had planned for, and it was all gone. But once we got over that initial shock, it was kind of like, well, wait a minute. Our neighborhood had already been declining, right? We started to notice the decline as certain industries were leaving, manufacturing was leaving the city of Chicago. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity for a rebirth of the community. And I had started to look forward to what were they going to do with all that property U.S. Steel sat on. I mean, it was lakefront property, 500 acres, contiguous acres in an urban setting. I thought for sure once they cleaned it up, that it was going to be very promising. It would be the catalyst the neighborhood needed so that we could be transformed and reborn. And that was in the 80s. And here we are. This is 2021. And we're still waiting for that rebirth. We're waiting for that transformation. And so in the process of, again, I kind of stayed here. My family, I had my mom, my grandmother, everybody still lived here. So I stood here. I decided I was going to stay and live in the Southeast side. Like I said, hopeful that things were going to change anyway. But as time went on and I got busy, I stopped paying attention to the fact that nothing was happening. And it wasn't until I moved to Slag Valley. Now, get the name Slag Valley associated with steel. Slag is a waste product of the steel industry. When I moved to Slag Valley over 35 years ago, I just moved in, painted my front porch this beautiful light gray. Within 2 days, there was this black sooty coating, and I couldn't understand what it was because it's like I just painted this porch, freshly painted. Someone came to visit me, and as they walked, they were leaving footprints in the soot, right? This fine dust. And I couldn't figure it out. And then I realized that the coal yards that were 3 blocks away and the pet coke piles 3 blocks away, that was where they were the source of this fine sooty dust. And so once I saw that, I started to pay attention, got involved with my neighborhood organization, and then I started to make the connection between the detrimental impacts that the industrial corridor had on our community. And it became very obvious to me that we weren't seeing any transformation, we weren't seeing any change. And it was partly because we were going to be the accommodating community to accommodate all the industry that the city was trying desperately to hang on to, and that it didn't matter what was put here as long as it meant the city would gain something from it. And it didn't matter the impacts on the community, on our health, or the vitality of the community. That was not important. It was only important that we accommodate what the city needed. And we were basically then the sacrifice zone.
And you have a much different vision of what it can be. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So once I got involved with the task force, and everyone said we were the no people. We said no to everything. We didn't want, residential building on the wetlands. We didn't want the firing range. We didn't want the coal gasification plant. We were saying no to everything. So we tried to be proactive. And we sat down and we looked at our industrial corridor and we said, what could be different about it? How could we change that? And we knew that zoning was key because we are one of the only industrial corridors in the city of Chicago that is zoned for hazardous waste. So can you imagine that our industrial corridor that is adjacent to residential communities, in some cases across the alley from where people live, was zoned for hazardous waste? And so we're thinking, okay, what would it look like? And again, we looked at it, we said, well, we understand industry. We don't want to say no to industry, but what mattered was the type of industry. So we didn't want industries that were going to be polluting. We didn't want industries that were going to have negative impacts on our air. We didn't want the dirty, bulk storage. We didn't want that. We had enough. And we knew we already had way too many scrap metal yards because they were popping up like mushrooms, right? Because of the amount of acreage available. And so we knew those were all the things we didn't want. But when the city built Method Plant, which is a factory in the Pullman neighborhood that makes natural cleaning products, and we saw how beautiful it was and the type of thought that went into it and the green initiatives that went into it, we were hopeful that that was the type of development we would get in our industrial corridor. And so that's what we looked to. We looked to that to be like a baseline. And we said, if we have to have industry, it should be like manufacturing. If we have to have industry, it should use renewable energy. If we have to have industry, it should be all of these things, which you can find on our website if anyone cares to look. And so we had a whole new idea and we proposed it to our alderman, who was Alderman Pope at the time. And he was like, yeah, he sort of agreed with it, but it didn't go anywhere. It never went anywhere because we were already deemed the community that was going to be sacrificed for the redevelopment of the city of Chicago.
And Olga, why don't you, I want you to elaborate a little bit on this. You've stressed to me that, you know, community groups are no way about, you know, killing jobs or stifling the economy. So, yeah, I mean, Olga, could you talk about, you know, what residents should expect of, you know, businesses coming in the Southeast Side, and maybe, you know, maybe talk a little bit about the Alliance report.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for putting together this event. I really appreciate all of your reporting, Brett. And also thank you to the Chicago Community Trust that also funds the work that we're doing at the Alliance. So I just want to give that shout out. Yeah, I think, like, you know, Peggy is saying, like, that once, like, we knew better and we knew that there was like ways that companies can operate responsibly, we started to dig in a little bit more, because there's companies, you know, that would say things like, you know, you're gonna run us out, we're gonna move to Indiana, and there's always that threat, like, that they're gonna leave, and they're gonna leave with, you know, and take these jobs with them. But the fact is that we live on a working river, and it's a river, the Calumet River, for folks who don't know, is right by, it's an international port. It's connected to our beautiful Lake Michigan. And we have realized that if we want to keep this kind of working river, you know, viable, and also viable for the residents who live around, we need to start to prioritize public health and the way that those businesses impact our health. Because what has been happening is that we have, like, these two options. It's either jobs or your health. And we know that we can actually have both. So we have to make the case about the impacts to our health. And, you know, I think the fact that this project, this General Iron project, has been able to get so close to approval before a serious reckoning with the cumulative pollution burdens that are borne by the Southeast Side residents is proof of the systemic environmental injustices that plague the city's policies. So we believe that the city can actually choose a different path now. And especially with the respect of the health and everybody who lives in this community. So the Alliance for the Great Lakes has been working really hard for 2 years to release this research with work that was, I mean, we have so many people that were chipping in to do this work, our local partners that are also leaders in the fight against General Iron, like the Southeast Youth Alliance, ASE, the Alliance for the Southeast. We had Parents for Extraordinary Children and groups, 9-3 Studios. We had, I'm just gonna read the list right now so I don't leave anybody out too. Working Together for Peace, Metropolitan Family Services. We had Centro de Trabajadores Unidos, and folks who usually don't work with like zoning and permitting and land use decisions to really dig in and figure out, like, how does the activities along the river impact the work that we're all doing that has to do with improving the quality of life of people in our community. So we took our time to create this advisory committee to start to talk about these issues. And the data that, you know, is in this report shows that the root cause of the location of so much pollution has these cascading impacts of the Chicago zoning regulations, which have been concentrating all of this pollution in Black and Brown communities. So for decades. Now there's this chance that, you know, the city can actually do something better, because after so many years industrial corridors are reevaluated. And we've seen that the city of Chicago has done these industrial corridor modernization initiative processes in other parts of the city. And, we've been told that our community is next. So we want to use public, health outcomes as a layer that we use to evaluate the industrial corridor here. Because, when these companies move in here, and this is something that one of the hunger strikers that were on a hunger strike, Chuck Stark, he's a teacher at George Washington High School, says all the time, like, these decisions are gonna impact this community for generations, like a company moving in to a community like this will be here for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. So we have to think very carefully and figure out how are we going to be able to sustain a working river that's going to be able to provide jobs that are not going to cause, people to get sick. But also, like, we just have to do these things responsibly. So I think that's where we are right now. I think as far as a community and organizers and researchers and planners, is that we have all this data, we have all this information, we have amazing groups that we work with across the city. But what is lacking is the political will to operationalize these plans. There's not a shortage of ideas for making the situation better. But like I mentioned, when I first started talking, like that this is an industrial corridor, it is an international port, and it is extremely important for the economy of this region. It's not going to go away if we put restrictions that are going to protect the people's health. The companies will adapt because there's too much money to be made, to be honest. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And I think that we need to like err on the side of let's protect the people who are living there. And if those industries, don't want to adjust, then we need to start to think about the kind of industries that we want in this community. Industries that are rooted in sustainability, that are going to be restorative to our community, that is not going to cause us more harm but help us. And that's what we need to start to think about.
It's a good segue for Gina to come in here. I want you to talk about transparency and accountability in government. And so let's talk about the transparency that I know the city's promised a comprehensive review of this Calumet Industrial Corridor. I don't know, are you guys hearing anything about that? I also know that, Mayor Lightfoot has met with environmental justice groups, and she seems to, she came into office and she said a lot of the right things, right? And she put an chief environmental officer, sustainability officer in place. And just, this is an opportunity. Let's talk about what City Hall can do for the Southeast side.
Yeah, I think that there definitely needs to be more transparency with the city and the community groups. So Peggy, myself, and Olga meet with the Chicago Department of Public Health. We have been for the past several years. And, it's so important to have that seat at the table. And we fought really hard to have that seat at the table. But even with those meetings, when we're invited in, we still find ourselves getting shut out. Some examples include finding out from a newspaper that there was lead and arsenic in a Little League field. We weren't told that at any of our Chicago Department of Public Health meetings. There was also an Inspector General report that said inspections were down by 60%, which is key to finding out information and transparency on the Southeast side, is to have inspectors coming out when we're reporting these foul odors. And if inspections are down by 60%, all of our concerns are falling on deaf ears. So really there needs to be proactive transparency and information gathering at the city and the state level, because we find ourselves reacting all the time. And it's really hard to think of these beautiful visions for our neighborhood when we're constantly sidetracked by pet coke piles, manganese contamination in our air and our soil, lead and arsenic in our little league fields, trying to get a Superfund site cleaned up, attending meetings for combined disposal facilities that want to be right next to Lake Michigan, and then the relocation of General Iron. You're battling all of those things. So it's super hard to keep track of. You know, living in an environmental justice community means that you're a scientist, you're a researcher, you're a health expert, you're a planner. And I just want to be a mom. I just want to, you know, take my son out and not have to call 311 because it smells so terrible. So it's really just a lot to take on. Like, but frankly, all of us are doing the city and the state's job.
I'm going to throw this question out for all of you. I mean, you know, city planning is just so crucial to the lives of the people and communities. And some of our viewers tonight have sent questions in advance, and they ask very specific things about land use and zoning. And let's just talk about what are some things we can. What do you do about brownfield redevelopment, for instance? And what are some things that we could look at, as a city in terms of the zoning in your area? And how, like, let's say specifically when we talk about brownfields, what about all those old steel mill sites? I mean, what do you do with them?
Oh, well, yeah, I'd like to say that first off, we need funding to clean them up. This is something that I learned, and I hope everybody who's listening realizes that the goal should be not to contaminate to begin with. That's a lesson that everyone should learn. If you ever walk on the Shroud site is a 70-acre site that just recently got put on the Superfund list site. If you walk on it, nothing grows there. 70 acres of nothing growing there. That tells you something about the site. And when you see that, and if you think you're going to restore that, how much money is it going to take to restore this area that nothing grows on? Okay, I don't even see little mice running across. Okay, we see no kind of sign of life there. And the issue with that Shroud site is that it is adjacent to Indian Creek, which runs past it and heads into the Calumet River. And so, it's not only the land that's contaminated, it's the contamination that eventually gets into our waterways that everyone listening needs to be concerned about. But the point is, we need money to clean them up. We need money and I know that, the process is to try to find the accountable, people who did the initial contaminating, but that process takes forever. And if you aren't able to hold them accountable, then what happens? And that's what's happened in our case. We have, hundreds of acres of land that nobody wants to be responsible for, and we can't get the funding to clean it up. So what happens? We get industries like scrap metal outfits that can operate in those kind of environments. And so the first thing we need to do is find funding, and the city has to be able to make that a priority to clean up these brownfield sites.
You've actually petitioned EPA to look at the Acme site, which I think is over 100 acres, right? And it's
yes.
Anybody who's familiar with the area, anybody's been to Big Marsh, one of the last parks,
right,
of the Manual administration.
So
their logo actually has the chimneys there there's a picture of them, the chimneys.
Yes.
Tell you actually, I mean, you done some research. I know you and Keith, and you've done this research of how have areas like this been reused before? I mean, you could take maybe
worst case,
some of it. Go ahead.
Right. Worst case scenario, you encapsulate the contamination, and you could use them for things like solar farms because they sit on top. and they don't necessarily have to, you don't have to dig down too deep to install a whole solar farm. And so we could use things like that. But again, it goes back to, we would like to be able to restore these places to where they can be used by people. And we have so much wildlife here that we also have to be considerate of them. And so they should be given a quality environment the same way we should be given a quality environment. So it's all about cleanup, and it's about, again, having the political push to do that kind of cleanup in communities like ours. It's like we're looked upon as post-industrial. They've had their era. Okay, just, let's move on to the next thing. Okay. And we're just so neglected. And it's a shame, because in the city of Chicago, to find the amount of open space we have and to be able to use that as a kind of a respite area so people could retreat from an urban environment and come into nature. I mean, that's invaluable. And so I hope the city starts looking at us as being extremely, valuable beyond the industry that's here.
I
I want to chime in here too, if that's okay, Brett.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, with the data book, like we actually have really important information. So some of like the key findings that from the data book is that we have a disproportionate amount of sick people here. Okay, we have the rate of coronary heart disease is higher in this area compared to the rest of Chicago, but also when comparing it to other industrial corridors, the rate of COPD is also higher in this area compared to the rest of the city of Chicago. Large portions of this, the study area is also medically underserved. So this is a term that's designated under the Health Resources and Service Administration, where residents face a shortage of primary healthcare services. The toxic releases in our community, the study found that several polluters would sustain high scores in the corridor. So in particular, we have like one company, American Zinc Recycling, has grown to have some of the highest of these RSEI scores in any polluter in the corridor. And then the failures of the zoning and land use policies in the city. So the city currently, they proposed these land uses and zoning policies that are not sufficient to support the community's goals, like Peggy has been talking about, a healthy and environmentally just corridor. From 1990s to the 2010s, the Calumet Industrial Corridor increased transportation, communications, utilities, and waste uses, and other industrial uses at the expense of the residential and commercial uses. And I think, so now we have data. So before, like when we would talk to the city, it would always be anecdotal, but this information from the data book really is foundational for us to be able to make the recommendations that we are calling for. So things like a public health focus. So future planning in the corridor should incorporate and prioritize the public health of the community. Residents' voices need to be heard, when we're making these planning decisions that are going to impact the community for just many years ahead. So they need to also just tap into the expertise in this community, because when you think about all of these different environmental justice campaigns that we have been a part of, from the coal gasification plant that we stopped, from coming to the exact same spot actually that General Iron wants to come to, and the enormous piles of pet coke that were blowing willy-nilly all across the community, to manganese in our front lawns and backyards, and all of these issues were not caught by an inspector from the city. These were issues that were brought up by community people who were noticing these problems or were trying to stop a problem from happening. And we need to stop playing this game of whack-a-mole. We need to have the policies in place, and we're recommending that the city commit to real changes. So stricter regulations, more frequent inspections, more severe penalties, so that when a company is fine, it just doesn't become like the cost of operating in our community. More transparency, like Gina was talking about, and also for the city to reevaluate its economic incentive programs to attract more sustainable businesses to the corridor. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to be a race to the bottom if we don't put in a plans and actually figure out how to attract businesses like the method plant. And I mean, the last thing, when we started this research, it was very clear that we're going to need more research. We need more data, data that is publicly available, that that it's easy to access. Like if for instance, some of these reports with like toxic releases that are on the IEPA's website are in PDF form. So if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, you're not going to find it. It's like looking for a pin in a needle in a haystack, right? Like we have to have transparency is absolutely key. But who does it benefit to have these systems completely inaccessible by people, by everyday people? I mean, I think we all know the answer. So if the cities and the state of Illinois are serious about environmental justice and addressing environmental racism, these key things need to change as soon as possible.
So going back to the brownfields, we do need the funding to clean up. And that's, I think, still first and foremost, because plants like the method plant, they had looked in the 10th ward, but they decided not to come here because there wasn't any space that wasn't contaminated that they could build on. So that's why they went where they went. Okay. We wanted to, the task force was interested in a steel mill museum that we wanted to put here, because we felt that steel had told a very important story and played an important part in the history of our nation. We couldn't do that because the land where they wanted to put it was the Acme Coke site. It was so contaminated that it would have taken too much funding to clean it up just to build the steel mill museum. So those are the kinds of things that happen to us because of this contaminated and contamination that's been here for decades.
So is it your hope, all of you, that this industrial corridor review that will be coming up, Olga, you think you're going to be well armed for this process, or are you worried that this is going to be like window dressing and it's really just the city's way of charging hard into the more Amazon style warehousing? If you all want to weigh in on that one.
Well, I haven't given up hope. I'm still here, right? Like, I'm still doing this work. I think there's too much at stake to not be hopeful. But also, we have a lot of work to do to one, demystify planning and zoning for a community like ours that is so impacted by it. So that's something that we have taken on, the three of us, talking about like brownfields with our communities. Peggy has a very open door policy, at the office, people come in all the time and with clippings, thinking about Jim Kinney here and some other folks, they'll probably find one of your articles, Brett, and then they'll come to the office and what's this about, and being really patient with our community members, because let's just not forget that we're still in the middle of a global pandemic that has really hit hard this community. And I'm just gonna I have to bring up Oscar Sanchez here, who's a leader, youth with the Southeast Youth Alliance, who says it is always us. It's our community that protects our community members. So when COVID hit, he was one of the folks who helped coordinate a COVID response network. We didn't know anything about the virus. We started to share information, and a lot of the people who were part of that COVID, program, ad hoc group of people who got together and just started to put information out, especially on Facebook, were people who were already working together to create the Calumet Connect data book. That we had already had that trust and we had already been working together. And that's really important, you know, to be very cohesive in the community. All these organizations that are working on these issues, we may not agree on everything, but on the issues of public health, like that is an issue that really does unite the community, and is going to be really important when this process, you know, is finally launched with the city, so that we can have that united community front making these demands of this process, but also of city council, you know, also of the state of Illinois, the county. No one is exempt, right? Like I think at every level of government, we have to definitely be imposing our will. It's not enough, like when Gina and Peggy say, like about having a seat at the table. If the process, if these changes are not happening, you know, like it's not enough for them to see us, you know, and to hear us. And I think that's where we are right now. We're barely holding the front, you know, with the current regulations that exist right now. You know, we've been just holding the front, and it's going to take those policy changes so that we can actually so it could just be illegal to dump on people and to keep the Southeast Side community the city's dumping ground.
I wanted to add something. I think really what we're trying to do, especially with this modernization process, is to make sure that the city isn't checking a box. It's really telling that the modernization process started in the North Side and our ward is the last to go through the process. And so I think that's why all of us wake up in the morning, is to, you know, hold them accountable. And what I feel like I've learned from this whole General Iron permitting experience is the city is kind of taking a lot of cues from the state. So, you know, New Jersey passed some environmental justice legislation last year that proactively identifies overburdened communities and only grants and renews permits for covered facilities where there's no like disproportionate or cumulative burden. So, you know, I think if we kind of have to like hit hard at the state in order for the city to start listening to us more, if that's what it takes, because we're not seeing it here, especially if General Iron is granted this permit.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought the EJ legislation up. You know, as we saw, the long promised Lightfoot air ordinance just finally, you know, got out of a committee, although I believe the changes are not to the liking of you guys, you know, who would, I think at one point thought that, you know, there was a pretty good proposal there. You want to spend a second on that? Because I mean, you know, Angela Tovar, the sustainability officer, said that she'd like to see a cumulative burden. That's you know, the cumulative environmental burden, you know, should be taken into account as you're citing manufacturing, et cetera. She'd like to see that kind of a legislation at some point. What are your thoughts?
I mean, it's in the city's own data that they have the air report that says like, these are the things that we're going to do to address these problems. And doing a cumulative impact analysis that I think is like number 2 on the list. And it's not like it's not happening in other places, right? So like we know New Jersey has a cumulative impact regulation. So the fact that there's going to be tons of emissions coming from like the applications that we've seen recently, like with General Iron, that would be allowed in a community that is already overburdened is absolutely unconscionable. And if we don't change those policies, if we don't get something like an EJ ordinance or a cumulative impact ordinance, we're never going to stop having to play this game of whack-a-mole.
I want to spend just a few minutes here addressing some of the and we've done this a little bit throughout the, tonight's event, but a number of viewers gave us questions in advance. So I'm going to just touch on some of them. And, in some cases we had multiple, questions that were kind of similar, and I'll just kind of group them together. But some of them are quite specific, like what's the plan for the Shroud site? You mentioned it, Peggy, it's 70 acres of, highly toxic land, nothing grows on it. I heard, people used to ride their dirt bikes on there or their ATVs. Not a good idea, by the way. But what do you do with, what's the plan for that? I know it's going to be a while, but what do you do?
Well, first of all, you have to, like I said, remediate it, clean it up. Because the other thing people have to understand is when there's soil contamination, it doesn't stay contained to the site. You got the wind blowing, like I said, you have, it leaching into the waterways that flow past it. So it doesn't stay contained necessarily. And so we have to clean it up. And what I would like to see is, because it is close to a natural park, we could put in more park space, or we could put in light manufacturing. That would be fine. Something like that, but we surely don't want any more piles of anything. We don't want any piles of anything. And we don't probably want anything that requires an IEPA permit, because that in itself is telling. We have enough of industries that require those types of permits. We're saturated. It needs to stop. And so definitely cleaning it up first, and then trying to come up with, but cleaning it up to the utmost level, because there are different degrees of cleanups. We don't want it cleaned up to just an industrial level, because that means then you only have a limited purpose for it. We want it to be cleaned up to the utmost level, and then that gives us the ability to pick and choose what it could be used for.
And I don't know the specifics, Peggy, but I think you do more about the Shroud site. And it's kind of like a very scandalous story.
Oh yeah, so the Shroud site, yeah, of course, the Shroud site is full of waste from the steel industry. But once it was identified that it was contaminated, it was actually sold to a private owner. And that's why it's called the Shroud site. And he bought it for probably pennies on the dollar. Who knows? I don't know. It's never been, disclosed how much he paid for it. But he was sitting on it, and he was supposed to take the responsibility for doing some cleanup. And he just sat on it for years and years and years, hoping that because of the Ford Supplier Park that was built, that eventually, that kind of building would continue on, and he'd make a jackpot with that property. But he sat on it for years, and even though they tried to go after him, they weren't able to hold him accountable for anything. And now it's going to be a Superfund site, and who knows how many years it's going to take to get it actually cleaned up. In the meantime, again, it's accessible. People do go on it to do ATV, right? I mean, we shamed them about a year ago on Facebook, and that kind of curtailed the actual activity there, because I finally said, look, people, when you see a piece of property or land that nothing grows on, think about that. Think about it. And you're taking your children on there. So rethink what you're doing. But and so the activity sort of kind of waned from that point. But the point is that, we need to see it cleaned up. And that's the other thing. Our city is losing money because these properties could be reused and recycled into being a source of economic development for the city, a source of taxes, a source of so many things, that it doesn't make sense to me that the city just ignores them and lets them languish there, being unproductive.
There's another very specific question about how you all think the economic development tool of tax increment financing has worked in the 10th Ward and beyond.
We in the 10th Ward, we're tipped like a turkey. We're like, we have so many tips. And what do we have to show for it, really? Okay, so I think it kind of answers that question. The other thing is that we have had some TIF funds ported to other communities, and that's something we don't like either. So our TIF funds have actually been ported for development in other areas like Pullman, and it just doesn't make sense. So I'm not a big fan of TIF funds.
And in particular, I think the one that you're talking about, Peggy, was like building a road to be able to connect this community to the new Walmart. And I find it just absolutely disgusting that we would be subsidizing for, like one of the richest families in this country, the Waltons. So like they should pay for that. We should not be paying for that with our tax dollars. The whole TIF, we talk about it also in the data book. I mean, it is extremely complicated, a complicated system. The oversight for TIFs, really just sits with the mayor. I mean, we've seen areas, beautiful areas in the city in downtown that are TIF districts. And I don't think that, I think that we need that the whole TIF system needs a whole new revamping. We need oversight. I did a lot of work with participatory budgeting before coming to the Alliance. And I think people in the neighborhoods, they know exactly what they need for their communities, and using a system like a participatory budgeting process that gives power to everyday people to spend, the funds, like in the city right now, we use like discretionary funds that every alderman has. Our alderman used to do participatory budgeting. She doesn't do it anymore. But we want to see more opportunities like that, because who better to ask and to say, like, how do these tax dollars should be spent than the people in the communities who live in those neighborhoods.
Yeah, and the other thing, Brett, is we see our schools shortchanged because of TIF. Because of the TIF system, our public schools are shortchanged. Our forest preserves are shortchanged. I mean, the public should come first, and we should not be making it easy for developers to get their hands on dollars that they should have themselves. It should be their risk and their investment and not ours. So that's, like I said, and some neighborhoods are TIFed, but what do they have to show for the fact that their TIF dollars are being collected somewhere, and what's happening to them? Like Olga said, it's a very complicated system, but I just know that we're being shortchanged.
Yeah, the North Point facility that's getting built on the southeast side is benefiting from a TIF. And you have across the street, pretty much, the high school I went to high school there, it still looks the same, it's falling apart. George Washington Elementary, also within that same area, is completely falling apart. And then Lincoln Yards has $1 billion of TIF funding poured into it, while our neighborhood, the 10th Ward, is continuously neglected.
We got several questions too about just getting involved as an individual or a group. I mean, this could apply to any community, but I mean, if I'm just a resident or part of another group, I mean, what do you suggest?
Great question. I mean, I mentioned before that the Southeast Environmental Task Force office is in the Hegwish neighborhood, 133rd and Baltimore Avenue. And we are being careful right now because of the pandemic, but if you go to the Southeast Environmental Task Force website, you'll see that there's a way for you to join as a member. There's, if you want to make donations and like being like a paid member like that, stay in touch with all of our organizations on Facebook and social media. There's a lot of work to be done still in our community, and we're, especially as this industrial corridor modernization initiative is going to launch. We hear now that it's going to be in the third quarter, so getting ready for that and staying engaged. I think Peggy, Gina, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but reach out to us because we could use a lot of help.
Yeah, so if you visit also the Facebook page, we try to post any actions that are upcoming, and we always can use bodies. We also need people to just be aware. So when it comes time to vote, that they keep all of this in mind. It'll be very helpful to us in case we decide that we should have other people in office instead of the ones that are here currently. So we just need people to help with all, from every possible angle. We need support.
So we're getting to the end of our time here. I want to thank you guys very much, and you know, any last words? Anything we didn't cover? If not, thanks for everybody who tuned in. You know, get involved in your community, support local journalism. Quick plug for the Sun-Times. I guess we've got some great subscription offers going, so check those out. You can find my environmental coverage at suntimes.com, and we also have daily updates on COVID-19, including latest information on vaccines. So again, thanks to my guests. Thanks to Chicago Community Trust and our readers and everyone who took part tonight. We'll be doing more of these, so check back with us on Sun-Times Facebook and Twitter, and of course, suntimes.com, and good night. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Gina, Olga. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. So.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone who turned into tonight's live stream. As Brett mentioned, don't forget to check out our e-paper at paper.suntimes.com and our essential coronavirus coverage at suntimes.com/coronavirus, suntimes.com/pages/podcasts to keep up with politics and all things Bears. Don't forget to head over to our digital offer to get unlimited access to both the e-paper and every story on suntimes.com for only $2.49 a month at suntimes.com/subscribe. Thank you to everybody and have a good night.